substance. Welcome to Webinar 2 in our series supporting children affected by prenatal substance exposure. My name is Brenda Farrell, and I'm a project analyst at the Abandoned Infants Assistance Resource Center. Today's webinar is presented by Dr. Lynne Katz. Dr. Katz is a research assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Miami. He's the director of the university's Linda Ray Intervention Center for High-Risk Children ages 0 to 3. Dr. Katz is a recipient of the Regional Child Welfare Outstanding Community Partner Award for Leadership in Early Childhood and Parenting Program Collaborations and Research with the Juvenile Court. She's been an advocate of evidence-based services for families for over 2 decades and has researched quality early education programs, early intervention outcomes, and parenting services. Before we start, I'd like to remind you that you can ask questions using the chat feature in the lower left portion of your screen. We will leave some time at the end of the presentation for questions, but you can chat your questions in at any point. Questions will be answered in the order in which they are received. And now, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Katz. Dr. Katz, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Brenda. It is really a privilege to be with all of you today to talk about a subject that is near and dear to my heart and the passion that our team has brought over the last 2 decades to developing a model program for infants and toddlers born prenatally exposed. I would like to, at the very beginning, acknowledge a host of colleagues, but in particular, I want to acknowledge our local dependency court judge, Cindy Lederman, and also my research coordinator, Dr. Marianne Ullery. So let's begin with our topic today. Our topic today is programs, model programs, and their outcomes that work to support the children and families involved with substance exposure of their newborns and moving forward longitudinally through their developmental cycle. Today we're going to talk about the theoretical underpinnings of the Miami Linda Ray Intervention Center model. I'm going to talk about the core components of the model to provide that practical application to those of you who are listening, and also talk about all of the system changes that needed to occur over the last 2 decades for us to support this very vulnerable population of children and families. We know that creating effective interventions takes a lot of systems integration, and oftentimes that's easier said than done. We also know that if we're going to get to sustainable outcomes, developmental outcomes for children, and sustainable permanency for young children born prenatally drug exposed, that we must be using research-informed interventions. And so as we have been developing our program over the last umpteenth years, we've always relied on the science of implementation research as part of the underpinnings of what we do. And what we've wanted to do is to improve outcomes for young children who are part of this University of Miami child welfare system juvenile court collaboration. I'm looking way back in time to tell you about how this program began in the early 1990s. For some of you who weren't around at that time, I can only tell you that in those days, we were hearing phrases like crack babies, cocaine babies, because the epidemic of cocaine use in the United States was huge, and researchers were trying to figure out who were these babies and toddlers, how could we best serve them, and what would model programs look like. But we were really at the inception of creating these conceptual frameworks. We had looked long and hard at the data that was coming out of our field of practice, and it was, for the most part, a medical model, looking at what are the effects within a child's body physiologically if they are born drug exposed. But we knew we wanted to look at more than just that, and we wanted to take the medical model more to a family systems model and a child development model. The purpose of the Linda Ray program from its onset has been to prevent subsequent developmental problems in children who we know are on a negative trajectory if no intervention is provided. What we didn't know, and I think in those days we wrote the book on working in a silo, because we were university folks we came from a research background. We had done a lot of research on the effects of substance exposure, but we didn't realize as we were developing the program how many other systems these families were connected to, these children. We didn't really even know that when a mother in those days used drugs prior to the delivery of her newborn, that the Department of Children and Families, our state child welfare agency, would be in at the very beginning involved in the life of this baby and toddler. In those days, and even today in many states, prenatal drug exposure of a baby is considered abuse by the mother prenatally. And so we knew we were going to come in contact with that system, but I knew nothing about the juvenile court. I knew nothing about child dependency. All I was knowledgeable in was the field of early childhood special ed and public health models that looked at outcomes for children and then retracted and said, what do we need to do to change those outcomes? So I can remember the very first time that I went into the juvenile court. I had received, a subpoena from the courts asking me to come to court to talk in front of a judge about a child that was in the Linda Ray program. And I can only tell you that I will always remember that first day in a courtroom. I think that the judge was sitting on a bench that was 20 stories high. I looked up at her and I identified myself as the director of the program, and she asked me to talk about what was the Linda Ray Center, what were we doing, why were we doing it for this child, and to make the case for early intervention. After I did so, and needless to say I was trembling the whole time I did it, the judge in her booming voice said, Dr. Katz, please approach the bench. I don't know how my feet carried me up to the bench to sidebar with her, but what she said was, this is extraordinary. How can we partner together? We need to have a meeting and talk about how the court and the Linda Ray Center can come together on behalf of these families. I backed away from the bench, and shortly afterwards a meeting was scheduled with all of the judges in the dependency system to talk about how we might work together and what would it take to integrate across our systems of care. Since its inception in the early 1990s, that partnership with the juvenile court was never going to be possible unless we had the funding we needed for the early intervention piece of the project. That funding came to us, and still does today, in a three-party agreement between our public school systems, pre-K program for children with disabilities, children's medical services that support in our state the early intervention system for children 0 to 3 years old who are at risk or with identified delays. And we've also always had substantial funding for support of our center overall from the Florida Department of Education Bureau of Exceptional Education and Student Services. So the Linda Ray Center, way back when and today, became part of the Part C early intervention programs under IDEA from the federal government to serve children 0 to 3 with verified developmental delays. However, the program was different. When we were talking about mothers in recovery or not yet in recovery, what had typically happened in our community is that moms would go into outpatient or residential treatment programs, and if they went into residential, their children would come along as what they were called the tag-alongs. The residential drug treatment programs in the 90s and in the year 2000, they knew a lot about how to help mothers who were coming to them for treatment. But once in residential, those programs had little services available for the children who came along and lived with mom during her treatment and recovery period. Other children, we soon found out, were placed with relative caregivers or put into foster care as a result of mom's substance abuse and their being prenatally exposed. There was little known by foster parents at that time as well. What does it mean to be caring for and nurturing a child born drug exposed? And the same was true with foster care parents. They'd had little experience with these children, and all they knew about was what they were reading in Time and Newsweek magazine, which showed the, quote, crack babies on the cover as children who were inconsolable, were hard to nurture, hard to feed, and so they set up a parent-child interaction process that was often very difficult, no matter whether that parent was a grandmother, a foster parent, or a mom in residential treatment. We decided we were going to see the world of these families through the eyes of the child. The child would be the intervention client. This was a new concept, but it allowed us to continue to serve the child even if the child changed caregivers, was not always in the custody of the parents, was with a relative caregiver or a foster parent. The continuity of early intervention was maintained across these systems. It happened through extensive cross-systems training, the establishment of mutual agreement contracts so that we could work together, exchange information, and the child was at the focus of the project. We also knew that if we were going to provide intervention, the curriculums that we used, per se, needed to be evidence-based. And this was an opportunity for us to develop such a curriculum. The curriculum at the Lynne Center, which has been published and is available for anyone who'd like to use it or review it, is called the Outcome Curriculum. And what made it unique is that it was written with a strong evidence and emphasis on building social emotional attachment with children and caregivers, and also understanding that these children were at high risk for developmental delays, particularly in the area of language development. Our project was curriculum driven, and at the same time, if you were to look at the outcome curriculum, you would see it is user-friendly. It is written at a third grade reading level. It has illustrations of positioning and ways of feeding children when they are babies that can be used by foster parents, they can be used by parents who are learning, and we use them, our teachers and our staff at the program. So we hope that the curriculum would offer continuity that could be used by multiple caregivers as well as our staff. The other parts of the program that we were developing was the understanding that to change attitudes and beliefs and support positive parenting strategies on the part of our moms and our dads and our families, we also needed to provide parenting programs. There were a lot of parenting programs that were out there at the time, supposedly for use with high-risk parents, but as we reviewed them, we often found out that these parenting programs really didn't look back at what had led parents to become substance abusers, and also what about parents who were using substances but also had co-occurring mental health problems. We needed to really investigate through federal websites which would be the appropriate parenting programs we could provide at our site. So we always engaged the families, the extended families, the foster families of the children in our program because we knew there needed to be continuity of care, continuity of the approach we were using, and if we all came to the table, the dosage of intervention would be amplified in a critical way. During the day that the children were coming to the intervention program, we knew that transportation would be a problem for families, for foster parents or grandparents with other grandchildren. And so our program, one of our core components was a fleet of transportation vans that provided door-to-door service to pick up the babies and toddlers every day and bring them back to their residence wherever that was. That meant we had increased attendance of children in the program, and with that, they were more able to get high degree of intervention, what we call dosage activities. Additionally, knowing how little resources the families had, we knew if we could provide breakfast and lunch and an afternoon snack to children, healthy snacks, healthy meals, that would help support them when they went home in the evenings. And so part of our contractual arrangements were with the Department of Health for the child care food program because our children qualified. In terms of the classroom, what did it look like in the nurseries of the early intervention program? Well, we maintained a very low ratio of adults to children. So in a nursery that had 12 babies, you would see a teacher and 3 trained paraprofessionals assisting to provide that 1-to-3 or 1-to-4 ratio. That way children were not waiting for adult responses. There was ample time for them to get one-on-one nurturing from the caregivers in the classroom. And we also knew that we needed behavioral health support from infant mental health specialists, which have been also supporting the needs of the children. I guess you could say that the program as we laid it out looked very much like a high-quality child care program. And I always, whenever I can, refer to the work of Jack Shonkoff. I will do so. And as he says here in this quote, there is such a positive relationship between child care, or in this case, early intervention quality, and outcomes for young children, particularly in families where there are the fewest resources and children are under the greatest stress. So what did our caregivers, what did we do? I've just featured some of the staff who worked for us in the early years, and what I was always proud to say was that nobody worked at the center because of the pay. They worked because, and continue to work, because they see that their roles as caregivers of these high-risk children is like being part of their family away from home. And so we typically have staff that stays for 10, 15, and some of our staff are here from when we started the intervention program. They are critically invested in helping to raise these children, if you will, in quotes, from the time they're infants until the time they graduate from us at age 3. That ratio that I was talking about has always allowed us to be able to provide one-on-one time, instruction, nurturing, book sharing, conversations with children, support of their emotional needs, because you have the ratio that you need between children and very needy children and trained staff. We also, as I said, had the opportunity to transport the children back and forth to the program on a daily basis using our vans. You can see one there. And many people asked us at that time, how do you drive in and out of these high-risk communities where the children you serve are living? Aren't you worried? Aren't you afraid? And the fact is that we were embraced by these communities. The families living there, the families of the children and their neighbors understood that the Linda Ray Center was a conduit for opportunity and growth on the part of their children. And so we were never vandalized or stopped. In fact, families helped us when high-risk situations were arising in those communities to make sure they shuttled us out of that street or that neighborhood as quickly as possible. Again, as I said, through a collaboration with our State Department of Health, we were able to provide the children with, and continue to do so, breakfast, lunch, and a healthy afternoon snack. You really can see the impact of providing healthy nutrition when the center is closed for Christmas break or for spring break. And what I mean by that is the families are struggling when all of the children are home to be able to feed everybody nutritionally when they're not coming to their school programs. And so over time, we've always tried to help by providing, in the early years, a food bank or sending home extra food to family during those periods of time when we're closed. And then I come to the component that is much less material and something you can't really wrap your head around, but it's every program that's going to be successful needs to establish a trust factor with the families and the children that you serve. I think what we have learned from our families over the year, because remember, we were university professionals coming to help families in very high-risk neighborhoods who at times often looked at us and worried that we were researchers and what were our intents. Well, we needed to, over time, be able to strengthen the interactions we were having with family members, with foster care parents, with elderly grandmothers who were raising their grandchildren. We needed to learn more and more about what the recovery process for substance abusing parents was like. We needed to understand relapse. We needed to understand treatment models so that we could be supportive even though we were looking out from the eyes of their child, their children. And we needed to find every opportunity to engage the relatives of the children, their kin, and any family support around the child. Establishing a presence in a high-risk community takes a lot of effort, takes a lot of passion, and it also takes ongoing searches for sustainability of funding to keep these programs going. I want to digress for a second and talk about one of the children in our program to give you an idea of the presenting issues that they brought to the table as infants. This is a story of Carolina. It's a composite of a number of children's stories, if you will, but I think it highlights what young children are facing. Carolina was identified as a newborn when child welfare made a referral for her to our program. She at that time was being raised by her paternal grandmother and her father's uncle. The father was nowhere in the picture, and Mom had abandoned her. Mom was on the streets, and at the time that we met Carolina, Mom was not engaged in any substance abuse treatment, and the burden of caring for Carolina fell to the paternal grandmother and her other son. Dad was non-participatory from both a court standard and from what we came to know of him over time. But Carolina's grandmother was sure of one thing. She wanted to give her granddaughter a better life and realized that she couldn't do it herself, even with her other son helping with her. And so that she knew if she agreed for Carolina to be in our program, she would have to engage in the program as well. When Carolina came to us as an 8-week-old, she was already showing some signs of her prematurity. She had difficulty soothing herself. She needed to be swaddled when it was time to go to sleep, and she had difficulties with feeding and swallowing. So at the university, we had the opportunity to enlist specialists, occupational therapists, physical therapists for her at the beginning, but soon we're able to very quickly fade those therapists out as our staff stepped into the role using the same techniques that therapists had used. And what was really wonderful was Carolina's grandmother, although she knew a lot about parenting, as she would tell me often, she agreed to participate in parenting classes so she could learn more about the unique special needs her granddaughter was going to have and become a more knowledgeable relative. Carolina was in our program, as all the children are, up until the time she turned 36 months old. We typically transition our children out from our early intervention program to other community providers. They may or may not move into a program for 3 to 5-year-olds with special needs, or they may transition to programs such as Head Start. So over time, over those 3 years, working together with Carolina's grandmother and her uncle and our staff and support staff, Carolina, began to clearly build the secure attachment with the staff that was in her classroom. We helped her thrive through nutritious meals that we were able to provide for her and also provide support to her grandma and her uncle. It wasn't long before we began to see improvement in her affect, from looking like a very sad newborn with a depressed affect to becoming more expressive in terms of her language and wanting to take the risks she needed of physicality to start to move through her developmental milestones. when we looked at Carolina at age 2, we would never have recognized her as a newborn had been part of our program. She was a child you could describe as joyful, affectionate, and was very into all the activities at school. I love this picture because this will give you an idea of what graduation looks like at the Lynne program when children are 3 years old. I'm not quite sure that they all keep their graduation hats on or that they remember the songs that they prepared to sing. But what our families tell us is that this graduation supports the promise that this child has a future, an educational future and a future of success. And for many of our families, they will tell us that no other member of their family has ever graduated from anything. During the period of time that we were building the core components of the program and working with the juvenile court and with our substance abuse treatment providers and our mental health providers, something interesting happened in Florida. Florida moved from a state-run child welfare system to a community-based care, which some people refer to as a privatized system of care. So we moved from a single authority, Department of Children and Families in our community, to having a setup of having a lead child welfare agency and 5 case management agencies. And so that spread out the number of folks that now needed to know about what is it the Lynne Center did, how do we send referrals, if I'm a judge, how do I refer a baby to you, if I'm a lawyer, how do I refer my client and her child to you. And so we really had to take our training models to scale. We needed to do training in many, many venues to talk about early intervention and the special needs of the children in our program. We were reaching out to multiple hospitals that were doing risk screening for prenatal drug exposure. We weren't just using a single local hospital. And as time went on, we found more and more children being referred to the Lynne Center for the screening evaluation and to see if they met eligibility along with their drug exposure for being in our Part C program. Another thing that happened during that time, again, not in our system, but in the legal system, was the Adoption and Safe Families Act in 1997. Why was that important to our early intervention program? That law stated that the well-being of young children who were identified as victims of prenatal exposure, abuse, and neglect was paramount. Well-being, along with safety, was going to be something that communities and judges needed to focus on. They needed to be sure that children didn't languish in foster care and grow up there, and there needed to be concurrent planning for children who could not go home because the situation was not safe enough for them. It also meant that there were shorter timelines to get children and parents into the services they needed, but it did impact our relationship with the juvenile court. Additionally, the backdrop from the juvenile court was also framed in the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act. States were required to have provisions and procedures for referring children under the age of 3 involved in substantiated cases of substance abuse or child neglect. They needed to be referred to early intervention services. And so judges who had never given any thought to this before were now thinking about making those referrals when a case came into court. So we had increased awareness. We had skilled folks out in the community, judges and case managers and lawyers who understood more about the special needs of this population and how substance abuse impacted developmental outcomes for children and the need for referrals and early intervention. And so as we built our program, we had increased children participating in the program, and over time, we started to be able to look at outcomes of children who participated in our program. Now, in one of the earlier slides, I talked about the fact that this was a randomized clinical trial when the Lynne Center first started. What does that mean? The substance-exposed newborns were randomly assigned to either our center-based program. We did at that time have a home visitation program, 3 hours a week, an educational focus on that, and some children were referred to a comparison group. I won't call it a control group per se, because the families did get activities that they could work with the young children, so they were not bereft of any services in general. As we started to see children's outcomes at 36 months, as multiple cohorts of children started to move through our program, we saw that the outcomes at 36 months for children were most improved for children in the center-based program. We saw less improvement on children on the home visited model, and as you might have expected, even less improvement on the part of the children in our comparison group. And so at that point in time, we decided to really put all of our resources into our one-stop shopping model at the center, and we discontinued enrolling children in the home visitation or comparison programs. We maintained all the core components of the intervention model in the center-based program. We continued to provide evidence-based parenting programs. At that time, the Strengthening Families initiative was being funded out of SAMHSA, and we had multiple funding opportunities to keep our evidence-based parenting programs going. We also realized that we needed behavioral health support and that there would be opportunities when the early intervention program, even with all of its core components, might not be sufficient to heal the relationship between the mom or the dad and the young child. And so we began to add second clinical intervention on an as-needed basis through a triage process we would do, and we added child-parent psychotherapy, Alicia Lieberman's model, to our array of services. So what were some of the outcomes we started to see in multiple cohorts of children who got the full Lynne Intervention Center program when we were comparing the home and center-based modalities? Well, we saw that children in the center-based model showed higher cognition and language scores at 36 months and significantly better language outcomes, which was one of our key findings. We are very lucky as well that our children are connected with the public school system, because through a collaborative agreement with the public schools, we are able to follow the children who have had the Lynne intervention program, to follow them out as they go into elementary school, onto middle school, onto high school. And very recently, we really looked at a cohort of children who had come through our program, and we looked at them in middle school. And what we found is that the children who had participated in the 25-hour-a-week center-based program had significantly lower rates of being in special education in middle school compared to students, when we went back and looked at our data, who had been in the home-based model in the early years of the program, when we still were randomizing the children to the two groups. The higher dosage of intervention appears for the center-based modality, and so we're seeing better outcomes even at middle school, which I think is very, very promising and encouraging about the sustainability of helping a very young child in the first 3 years of life, having everybody who works with that child and with that family be more informed, more knowledgeable about what the family needs, and also having our parents leave the 3 years of being involved in the program oftentimes with more knowledge about positive parenting. So for us, our research really has indicated that this full-time center-based early intervention program can be a key factor in changing the developmental outcomes for young children presenting with this prenatal drug exposure and developmental delays in the first 3 years of life. We even think it looks promising that they will be on the lesser side of needing special education as they get older, regardless of how they started their lives as infants. So how do we connect the dots about the components I've spoken to you about thus far? We've got to be thinking in our communities that babies born to substance abusing parents are at high risk for developmental challenges. That being said, we have to go beyond screening and assessing them. We need, of course, to put that in place, and our different states have different requirements for eligibility for Part C programs, but building evidence-based interventions for children in this vulnerable population is something that communities can do. We can change the children's trajectories and improve their outcomes. So testing for developmental delays is essential. However, connecting children and families to programs that work, programs that have evidence-based to what they're doing, is going to be essential, because just that identification in the first 3 years of life doesn't mean you are changing the trajectory for that child. We need to educate foster parents, dependency system, judges, about the resources and supports that early intervention can give to children who have multiple risk factors and have also oftentimes experienced traumatic stress. It's very interesting to look at some of what our federal partners are telling us. The National Survey of Child and Adolescent Well-Being that looked at service arrays across 3 sectors and continues to do so across the field of education, mental health, and primary health care, identified across a recent cohort that was examined nationwide that only half of children ages 0 to 5 identified as high risk for developmental and behavioral problems in child welfare had received those services 12 months later after initially being identified as needing to be referred. So what do collaboration activities look like, and what could those collaboration activities be in your community? I suggest that if you're not currently serving and understanding who the children in this vulnerable population are, that it is important to map your existing systems of care. What does early intervention look like in your community? What are your Part C or early step programs, depending how you refer to them? What do they require in terms of meeting eligibility for services? And if the standards for meeting eligibility are so high in terms of the degree of developmental delay, for example, that a prenatally exposed infant would need to meet to be in an early intervention program, think about what other system of care could help support the developmental needs of these children. What would it mean to your array of child care facilities if they had more training in terms of the special needs of this population of children so they could better provide services even if the children don't meet eligibility for Part C? What we don't want to do is to identify children in this vulnerable population under the age of 5, but wait for them to turn 5 years old to come to kindergarten with all of the issues we know they may have in terms of developmental delays. In Miami-Dade County, we have wonderful partnerships with our Head Start programs, and we can nicely transition children out of our Birth to 2 program at 36 months and work in advance, 6 months in advance with Head Start to wrap those services from the Linda Ray program to a Head Start program if this is what the family chooses to do. The child could then receive services if those services are needed, but if not, the child and the family can just swiftly move into the whole process of Head Start, having already done their enrollment and created their enrollment packet. The other part is community awareness. And we appreciate the substantial funding that we get from the Florida Department of Education, because what those training dollars allow me to do, and my team to do, is to really beat the bushes, if you will, and find people whose lives intersect with the families I've talked about and with these children, and to talk about increasing their awareness of what the positive outcomes can be if they provide quality services to the children and families at this very young age, that they can be contributing to what happens down the road in terms of the academic and social emotional outcomes for the children. And so initiating training opportunities where the topic of children born to substance abusing parents, what can be done for them, what the future and promise of their well-being looks like, is important in communities to build a wraparound structure of support for the families. And the other thing I think that we often don't do, those of us who are out and we're doing training and we're talking about awareness about a problem, oftentimes that training is done and the folks at that child care center or the groups of lawyers who come to the training, they hear about it for an hour or two and then they go back to their practice. What we know about implementation science is that when people are trained in a practice change, something they need to do to meet the needs of / a client, a child, a family, we need to be monitoring that, in fact, what they learned at the training is being carried out in their program. And so the other piece of training is how can you as professionals who have this knowledge about the special needs of this population, how can you take that knowledge to continue to support and to coach and to offer additional meaningful knowledge and resources to folks who are serving this very vulnerable set of children and families. The last thing that I want to talk about basically is what we need to do at the agency level when we are creating practice changes, when we are kind of upping the bar of what we're doing for this population of young children. How do we, within our agencies, track our outcomes? Not only tracking the outcomes in terms of what happens with the children, but also about how our organization has changed as we've now integrated our work with other systems, whether it be child welfare, whatever agencies you're working with, early steps, children's medical services, daycare. What does that qualitative change look like? It's really important to document that, to talk about what did we do in the process of better developing our services to meet the needs of this population of children and their families, and what did the outcomes look like in terms of keeping families engaged in the process of their children's education, looking at children with developmental delays who start off as infants but maybe move out of our programs, whether it be pre-K or early intervention, by the time they're 3, 4, or 5. How have we changed their lives? If you are going to sustain your agencies and your programs, you want to have outcome data that could support a grant that you want to write about what you've done, to put your agency out there to highlight what it is that you changed to better meet the needs of the children. And so I think it's really important internally, and sometimes we have to go to an outsider. If you are a community-based agency and you want to develop a plan for tracking outcomes when you're serving this vulnerable population of children and their families, think about collaborating with a college or a university in your community. Many of them have social work schools or departments of psychology, and they have faculty and students who are looking to participate in the development of research-based, evidence-based programs. And oftentimes they will collaborate with you at no cost, but they will take that burden of tracking outcomes away from your staff that is doing the heavy lifting every day with the children. So as we kind of, what were the core components of the program? I hope as you go back and look at the PowerPoint, you can review those. And I love this picture. There's a lot going on in the minds of babies and toddlers. That's what they bring to us even before they've been exposed to such critical risk factors, such stress, etc. And what we want to be able to do is to get them back to where they should be developmentally, to give them the joy in their lives, to be appreciated of what babies should have as positive experiences and toddlers should have as positive experiences. So again, to this end, the conceptual framework for everything we did was not only based on a public health model, but also what implementation science tells us. When we want to change a practice, what is it that we need to do? And I urge you again to use this as a resource. The Lynne Ray Center has been close to 30 years in the making, if you will. And with all that we've learned, there is so much left to learn. And so I've borrowed this cartoon from a colleague of mine that I work with at the CDC. We still don't have all the answers, but we keep asking the right questions. What is this population's need? How can we as communities collaborate to better meet their needs and to invest in their outcomes? Because we believe we have a responsibility in the field of early intervention to do so. And so I urge you to think about what you might do in your community to move forward, to really find a way to target the unique needs of this population. And I thank you all for listening today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Katz. We do have a few questions that have come in, so I will start by asking the first one. Do all states have a program similar to Lynne Ray's program, or is it handled by the local Department of Human Services?
Oh, thank you for asking that. As we said, this was most states have a framework for early intervention, and that framework is based on their interpretation of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, which has subsumed with it the Part C aspects of the program, which serves children 0 to 3, and then the Part B aspects of the federal laws that work with children ages 3 to 5. Eligibility criteria for program services and the plans for screening and assessment are typically developed by states, but if you're not connected with an early steps program, you're an interested professional, a good place to start would be with your local public school system and then to research your state eligibility guidelines for early intervention. In our community, our school system, our pre-K program for children with disabilities, and Early Steps Part C helped come to the table with us in our university to create our program. Yes.
Great. Our next question is, what if the parents continue the use of substances? How does that affect a child with special needs?
It critically affects the child with special needs. And with the children that we're working with, one of the 3 goals is safety, permanency, and well-being. And so the juvenile court, the dependency system, guides us through a process from day one that looks ahead at what if mom and or dad is unable to get their treatment needs under control and to not get on the road to recovery. And so from the very beginning of a case, there is an alternate caregiver identified for that child, who the baby is living with or experiencing. That could be the grandmother, etc. And the court here in Miami-Dade County is very cognizant of the fact that they should continue to be in touch with those of us in early intervention. So as they're planning that the child may not be able to go home, may not be able to have access to the family of origin, how to build that bridge with the pre-adoptive family, or continue to build the bridge with the auntie or the uncle or the kin who have decided that they can raise that child, and to continue to provide social emotional support for the child, and to hand that child's needs over when they leave my program to Dade County Public Schools or to pre-K, so that they can continue to help that child build healthy attachments, even if the family of origin is not going to be where the child is going back.
Next question is, whom can I contact locally to get a child evaluated for these types of problems? I live in Mesa County, Colorado.
I think you should start with your public school system. Contact them, ask them who is the Part C, like in child, who is the Part C provider or providers in the community. I have a child in need of a screening and potential assessment. I want to start the process right away. And every state should have a framework for this. Start with your public school system, and I think you'll be successful. And also look on the website for your state in the Department of Education and see in Colorado what sort of early intervention framework your state has committed to and what you can expect would be the conduits for screening and assessment.
How do you include parents in the services that the children are receiving? How do you encourage carryover when the children are at home?
Home visitation. Our staff, primary service coordinator, our social workers, and our behavioral health specialists continue to do outreach for parents, and I'm putting that in quote, no matter who that parent is. Parents need to feel that your program is there to advocate for their child, that it is strength-based, that we had to prove at the very beginning that we weren't an agency representing our state child welfare, and that our goal was to find fault with the parent and to try to take the children away again. And that's the trust factor I talked about. It comes from providing services, helping them with their challenges, both as a family and for their child, to taking down some of the barriers, as we've been able to do in the past with providing transportation, and always treating families with respect, even somebody who is the mother of one of your children and has just come out of being in jail. Treating them with respect, but always telling them in advance what your position is in terms of how they're caring for their child, and never blindsiding them as you work with them.
How often do you measure the effectiveness of your program?
We measure the effectiveness in terms of the children's developmental progress every quarter. Our children, for those of you who are familiar with special education, our children have individual family support plans, which is comparable sort of to an individual education plan that an older child would have. But the IFSP is committed to engaging the family in what they wish for their child and how to make that happen by engaging them in the process. We do it quarterly. Parents, we work with our families semi-annually and annually to provide documentation of what we're doing. And then as children move through our program and are graduating, on our research side, we can look at their outcomes developmentally, taking away any identifiers of a specific child, and look to what degree those children have improved by age 3 from the presenting delays that they brought to the program.
Following is a question and a comment. Have you tracked results related to program graduates' attachment to primary caregivers? The early intervention system needs to be challenged to meet the developmental needs of substance-exposed newborns at birth. The lack of a tool enabling the adult to quantify the level of delay is no excuse for not meeting the needs of a compromised newborn.
I totally agree. So what was the question?
Have you tracked results related to program graduates' attachment to primary caregivers?
No, we haven't. I will tell you that the follow-through, although we do have human subjects protection, that means that our families have signed consents for us to follow them out, to be able to see how that child is, how the child is doing in their home environment after they leave here. That is very difficult to do. Families move. Sometimes a child was with an adoptive parent when they left our program and their name was changed and we didn't know about it. So in answer to your question, longitudinal follow-up for us right now is not able to look at the quality of attachments as the children move on and get older. Our access is to educational data that allows us to have an idea of how the child is performing in school. We can look at how many days that child has been absent, and we can look at some of the data about their behavior in school and whether they are in special ed or not. But clearly, if there was the funding to do so, following those children out in terms of looking at attachment issues as they get older would be something we would certainly like to do, but unable to do so at this time.
What kind of barriers have you encountered in regards to cultural competency?
We have a very, very linguistically and culturally diverse population in Miami, Florida, which I'm sure doesn't come as a surprise to anyone. I think in order to be those competent teachers, paraprofessionals, administrators, our staff has to represent the populations that we serve, and we work hard to be a diverse population here at the center. We also rely heavily on learning from our participants. I've learned a lot from many of the grandmothers and the abuelas in our community about child care practices, about attitudes and beliefs towards substance abusing adult children that they have. And I think this is something we as an agency strive to do every single day in every interaction we have with a child and his or her family.
How did you meet the natural environment mandate for early intervention services when LRIC is center-based?
Well, we provide slots at our program for typically developing children. I wanted to say that because I saw that was a question. And so many of the professionals who have young children who work for me or at other agency have children in our program, and they are the role model children. Your point about natural environment is very, very important. I think that what we've done is to have the inclusion model, to have typically developing children and their families interacting with our families. But the fact is, for this population of children, when we looked at multiple cohorts who were served and assigned to the home visitation model, they were not making the developmental strides that we wanted to achieve in our program. And so by going out and seeing our children in their homes, having opportunities where children have experiences outside of the school, that's how we've dealt with it, because their home environments and their natural environments are high risk, often with a lot of exposure to violence, both domestic violence and community violence. And so we've interpreted this as creating a safe space for them 5 hours a day. Your point is well taken. Thank you.
What are some assessments and testing that can be used by caregivers to track development? We currently use the Ages and Stages questionnaire, but would like more assessment models to use for developmental delays.
Okay. We have an array of assessments and screeners that we use. For eligibility purposes, our state requires that we use the Battelle as our entrance eligibility criteria factor, and we do Battelles at 36 months when children leave. But we have a range of social emotional measures that we use. Much like yourselves, we use the ages and stages, the basic ages and stages, and the secondary ages and stages that looks at emotional needs of children and how they're performing social emotionally. We use a number of language measures, and we use the HOME, H-O-M-E, tool to look at what's happening in the home environment in terms of availability of books and early literacy. If there's a way, I'm happy to give you my email, which is lkatz, K-A-T-Z, @miami.edu. And if you'd like to email me to get the protocol of the assessment measures we use, I'd be happy to send them to you.
Where can we access the curriculum you mentioned earlier? Can a link be sent out to participants after the fact? Approximately,
yes.
How much does it cost an agency to implement the curriculum?
Yes, at this point, it doesn't cost anything. So you can read about the curriculum on a website called Sociometrics, and that will tell you about the curriculum. And if this is something that you think might work for your community, Brenda, I'm going to ask people, please, to contact us directly so we could talk about what that would be involved and what sort of support we could give you for its implementation.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Dr. Katz.
Sure.
Next question, is it mandatory for all hospitals to screen with blood work for drug exposure, or is it only if hospital staff suspect drugs?
I think that most of the hospitals in our community do a risk assessment when a mom comes in to deliver, and that risk assessment makes the determination if they're going to test for drugs. In some hospitals, if that risk assessment points in the direction that this could be a mom delivering who is not in recovery, there are still hospitals that test the meconium, the first bowel movement of the child, to see if they can detect drug exposure that way. So hospitals vary, but from what I am hearing is they are using risk screens to determine who to test. In some communities, maybe they test everyone. I'm not quite sure.
Question, could you please clarify the eligibility criteria to access your program?
Yes, the child has to, we have to confirm through a parent report that the mother was using during her pregnancy, and then the child can be referred to the Lynne DeRay program. At that point in time, the drug exposure is not sufficient. The child has to meet the criteria for the state of Florida in terms of percentage of developmental delay across multiple domains to meet eligibility.
I foster in a community where there are not a lot of resources. Are there places I can access or online tools to help me?
To be able to know more about how you can meet the special needs as a foster parent.
Yes.
I'm going to say this again. I have those resources. I think, Brenda, if we could really clarify what my email is, people have asked me to repeat that because the requests for individual resources, I'm happy to send what I have via email.
Okay, so we'll send out your email address to all the participants, Dr. Katz.
Thank you so much. And also I would be able to talk about how to access parenting programs through the 3 federal websites that you could explore evidence-based parenting programs developed specifically for parents dealing with substance abuse, child abuse issues. I could send the links for the 3 websites so a community could explore a parenting program that would work for them.
Our next question, what about your program's collaborative relationship with women's treatment providers?
Yes, I've been there since the beginning. We are a critical partner in our local dependency drug court, which is a collaboration between the juvenile court with an emphasis on differentiating substance abuse treatment for women and mothers, and to be able to support their special needs in our community. We have a very large collaborative as part of the Federal Family Drug Court Initiative, and we're a part of that, and a large emphasis is about the specialized treatment needed for women, how it differentiates from what men need, and also the differentiated treatment to engage substance abusing moms who have never parented one of their children without being addicted.
Okay, here's a follow-up. To your knowledge, has this curriculum been adapted to be integrated into any residential substance program for mothers and their children? Not at this point. We have a local, very large treatment facility in Miami-Dade County that we work on. It has a special, actually 2 programs, one in the south part of the county, one near where we are in central Miami. And they have specialized programs for women. What we have been able to do, both of these programs have set up childcare at their treatment centers, and we've been able to do training of their teachers in the past on the curriculum and how they might use it with the moms in their program and with the children during the hours that those babies and toddlers are in childcare with them. And for those children who don't get to come to Lynne because we can't accommodate them. So that would be a really nice way to move the curriculum into a women's treatment facility. And we would be happy to have conversations about helping with that. What type of trainings do we as caregivers need in order to be more effective? Well, we're talking about whether we are caring for the children in the home. If we're a foster parent, what we need is more specialized training through our foster parent training on the unique needs of this population of babies and toddlers. We continue to work and have been working, we're not there yet, even in our own community, improving the quality of foster parent training for some of these specialized needy children. And we've also been talking about whether foster care systems should have foster parent specialists, for example, foster parents who would have that additional training and knowledge to work with babies in their homes and babies who have that drug exposure. It's an idea that some communities are looking into, specialized, besides medical foster parents and therapeutic foster parents. What about having foster parents who specialize in the 0 to 3 period, and particularly with this group of children? That's an idea. If you are
a caregiver, if you are a grandmother or an auntie caring for your sister's baby because she is not able to do that, there are resources we could share that would help you help that baby who is more like every other baby and less different, actually, and should be perceived that way.
We have a staff person anxious to write a grant on tracking outcomes. Can you expound on some ideas to start this process?
Yes, send me an email and we'll set up a call to talk about it. You're going to want to track outcomes on what we call both the quantitative data, collecting changes, for example, in children from when they start your program till when they leave in terms of an evaluation, but you do not want to forego the qualitative side. What does the process look like? How are you measuring family engagement at the beginning of your program and at the end? And again, we are happy to have a phone call with you that might give you some ideas as you move forward. Send me an email and we can set that up.
In your parenting program, do you use any videos to educate parents or caregivers and extended family members on the effects of prenatal substance abuse on their children? If so, can you provide this information?
Well, I have to tell you that, and this is not in any way an endorsement, the programs that we used only here at Lynne by our community choice, we had, for multiple cohorts of families, we had used Carol Comfort's Strengthening Families program. That comes with all the tools that you're talking about, curriculum and videos. I'm not saying this is a program you should choose. I'm giving you just anecdotes. There are other programs. If you ask me for the websites of evidence-based parenting programs, many of them come with videotapes. I would like to also explain that when families are triaged to our child-parent psychotherapy, our clinical model, which is child and adult one-on-one, the videotapes that we use are their own videotapes to show them their responsiveness at the beginning of the program and to use it as a training tool as they move forward to acquire new skills when they're working with a clinician.
Does your program also work with infants and toddlers who were exposed to alcohol prenatally?
No, we don't. No, we don't. When a parent says that their addiction of choice was alcohol, that has always been an exception. Those children would not be in our program because we feel they would be better served by our community partners who have expertise in FAS.
I work in a community clinic setting in California where one of the largest barriers to getting children into care is transportation. As a result, our clinic is expanding home-based services. Since your program found center-based treatment to be more effective than home-based care, can you share any ideas on how to obtain funding for transportation?
Yes. For us, transportation was funded by our public school. We had a separate grant or separate contract for transportation for decades. And so it's really important to find out at the public school level what has your public school committed to in terms of serving Part C children meeting the criteria for developmental delays. The other place to try to get transportation, maybe in your community you have something like a paratransit system, which typically allows for families where someone has a disability to get to their service. Our paratransit system here in Miami has minivans, and maybe you need to sit down with them and say, what would the cost be if you transported, and what would the special considerations be if your paratransit system had the limited ability to transport this group of children in this catchment area? What would the actual cost be? So I would suggest that you go through your Department of Transportation in your community, look for, I'm using the word they use, handicap transportation services, and have a sit down with what you're doing in your expansion. Maybe it would mean at the start, and I know this may sound very cumbersome, but it might mean that when you got your pilot started, the first group of children that you were transporting, mom or dad would need to ride the van to bring the child to your program for the day, and then the van would need to pick up those same parents to pick up the children at the end of the day. You could pilot it. I know it sounds cumbersome, but in some communities, they've also been able to go through their local community transit system and be able to get metro passes or tokens for families who otherwise couldn't transport their children, but every month they're able to give those bus passes to the families if you report they've been compliant bringing their child to school every day or frequently. So those are some of the ideas we've used in the past. And we are able to, again, if you position yourself and you're looking for opportunities, look at the Family Drug Court initiatives, search that at the federal level and see what grants are being available for regional awards or startup of programs that serve families in treatment and recovery with young children.
Okay, we have a few more.
Okay.
Do you make records from a child's assessments in your program available to other schools and agencies after the child has moved on?
Okay, we have a lot of protections in place because we are a research program. And so we don't make anything available to anyone unless the child's parent or guardian says that we can. In the case of children transitioning from our program at age 3 to Head Start, we have agreements in place where the exit, Battelle, and other academic outcome data with parent permission and signatures at a time can move from our program to Head Start. The parent or guardian would have to give permission for that information or would have to share that fact about their child when they got to that new agencies. So, for example, if a child leaves Lynne DeRay at age 3, and then that child doesn't get any services, and the child pops up in kindergarten in our community, a school could not contact me to either say that the child was in the Lynne DeRay program at all or to give any data. The parent would need to sign the levels of consent, and that could be a guardian or an adopted parent, that they are going to allow us to release to that kindergarten, to that public school, because we believe in the privacy. We follow HIPAA and FERPA laws in terms of sharing individual child data. That is not done. They are protected unless we have informed consents that at that time get signed to release that data.
Okay. Our residential program in Tennessee is very similar to the LRIC. I am the director of the Child Care Center for these children enrolled. I have 8 NAS and SEI in an infant classroom with 2 teachers. Our ratios are 1 to 4, but they are in one classroom. Would you suggest separating these groups to provide better care? Why or why not?
How old are the children?
They're infants.
They're infants. So the total number in the room?
It would be, the ratio is 1 to 4, and there's 8 children.
I think that's a good ratio, and I wouldn't separate them. What I would suggest is, which I'm sure you're already doing, and I'd love to hear about your center, is lots and lots of training and coaching coming from you to help support what that experience feels like in the classroom every day for your teachers and your paras. How do you avoid compassion fatigue? How do you avoid burnout? I remember a teacher who had been at the Lynne Center years ago who a month into being in an infant classroom came to see me. She was distraught, and she said, I think the best solution here for the 3 children in my class who are in out-of-home care, in foster care, I should adopt them. I've been thinking about it, and I think that's going to be the best solution for them. And while her intentions were lovely, we had to sit and talk about what is it that you can do to keep yourself going, to provide that better than quality care that these children need. I'm not quite sure that adopting them is the solution or your role right now. And so lots and lots of support was needed for your folks, as I'm sure you already know. But I'd love to hear about your program. Please email me.
Okay. Can you elaborate on how an agency can establish a collaboration or referral process with the courts? What are some of the challenges that the agency should be prepared to handle?
Okay. How do you start establishing that collaboration? We did it. Here's how I did it. I created an illustrative, let me think of what I would call it, kind of like a genogram with service attachments that was about one of the children in my program. It showed how they had been in and out of foster care. It didn't give the child's name, but when I created this long, long document, the document about what the 3 years of that child's life had looked like out in the community, it covered all of the walls in my conference room. And then what I did was I put out an invitation to the dependency court administrator in our community, inviting all of the judges to come to Lynne and hear about our program. They were able to see, as they looked at the illustrative documents across all the walls, how a lot of them had been involved in the life of this Lynne child. They had made decisions. Those decisions were later overturned by another judge. I wanted to pique their interest to be involved in creating some continuity of approach for these children. For me, our judges were ready to hear this. But I believe that you have to create a reason why they would want to come and hear about your program and collaborate with you. And one of those reasons is that you can help support their goals in dependency of creating safe families for children to return to, for creating opportunities to identify permanent guardians for the children based on what you know about what it takes to raise an at-risk child, and that you're there to support the well-being piece that the court needs to assure. So you're going to want to spin why you want to collaborate them based on needs that they have. They have to follow the rules of CAPTA. They need to follow the rules in court of the Adoption and Safe Families Act, and your agency is going to help them do that and take some of the burden off of their process. They're going to want to come and find out who you are.
Okay, we have one last question. What are your attrition rates from center-based treatment?
From children in the program, you mean how many children? Attrition during the course of the program, it's very low. It's very low. I can look into the percentage, but the center-based program provides a number of things that families need. All of their services are in one place. Their children have the opportunity to participate in early intervention with a wide variety of children from different backgrounds. The families are supported, in quotes, by strengths-based caregivers. They don't have to pay for these services. They're free. So sometimes what it means is you're convincing a family at the beginning, and it doesn't take much convincing, that if your child meets eligibility as a baby for this program and continues to meet eligibility, you're going to have this early intervention program for 3 years, potentially. You can go back to work, you can go to school, you can finish your treatment, and you know that we'll be there for you. And so that's a real incentive, as are the meals, that the children will have healthy food, and that for many, and that your child will have a graduation at age 3. Different things appeal to different families, but when they start to see the improvement in their child over time, and they start to engage, if they need to, more appropriately with their child as they move forward in their treatment, these are kind of like intrinsic incentives for engagement, and I think that's why we have low attrition rates.
Okay, well, we have a comment that came in.
Oh, wow.
You, Dr. Katz. My niece actually attended Linda Ray. I am sure her life is better because of the time she spent at the Linda Ray Intervention Center.
I have to thank that mother who shall remain nameless, and the auntie, and I assure you, I didn't pay her to come on as the closing comment.
All right. Well, we would like to close it by thanking you, Dr. Katz, for speaking with us today. We really appreciate your time. I would also like to thank all of the participants on today's call. We greatly value the feedback of everyone participating in these AIA webinars. The link for a brief online evaluation form will appear shortly. Please take a few moments now to complete the form, and it will automatically be sent back to us. We would like to receive feedback from every participant, so if you are joining in this call as part of a group, please be sure each member of your party receives this link. For those who are interested, our next webinar in this series, Strengthening the Parent-Child Attachment in Families Affected by Substance Use, with Karen Gould and Beth Moran, is scheduled for May 12th. Also, if you would like a certificate of attendance, please contact Amanda Hopping-Lynne at hoppingwinn@berkeley.edu. You can find more information about the rest of our 2015 series on our website, aia.berkeley.edu. And thanks again.